This is the general who was initially assigned in September to take control of the entire theater. Once a decision was made in the summer to begin establishing what I would call a strategic defense in southern Ukraine, and to run the defense as an economy of force measure, they needed more unity of command than they had at the outset. And remember, at the outset, the Russians really did not have a very large force, and the force they sent into Ukraine was quite small. It was designed to essentially signal seriousness to the West. That all failed miserably. So the Russians had to go back and re-examine all their original underlying assumptions. The new assumptions in the fall of last year were, under General Surovikin, we're going to establish this defensive line, and then ultimately we are going to invite the Ukrainians to attack it. And with any good fortune, the Ukrainians will do so and bleed themselves. Now, what's happened in Bakhmut in particular, which gets so much attention, it's almost in the center of that strategic defense line. Bakhmut became a bloodbath for the Ukrainians because the Russians deliberately left roads open, access to it, in the hopes that the Ukrainians would indeed pour large numbers of their forces into it. Because Bakhmut was, from an operational standpoint, important, given its railroad nets, road nets, connectivity to the rest of eastern Ukraine. All of that has now come to an end. Surovikin was very successful, and I think when this war ends and we go back and look at it, Surovikin will end up being the individual that is remembered for his wisdom to defend southern Ukraine as opposed to make incremental gains over a long period of time, because there was great pressure inside the Russian general staff to make continuous gains to show that the Russians were winning. And Surovikin said, that makes no sense. Our first priority has to be to defend, invite the Ukrainians to attack, to kill as many of them as possible. And then secondly, to build up our reserves, to take in the 300,000+ reservists, train them, integrate them, assimilate them, so that we have a much larger combat force ready to fight. Now, there was an attempt to try and get that ready before January and February. And as you point out, the winter simply didn't come to fruition. We never had 2 weeks of solid freeze. In order to, as your viewers probably are aware, the black earth in eastern Ukraine is topsoil that goes down perhaps anywhere between 10 and 20 feet at virtually every location. And this topsoil is remarkable. As many Ukrainians and Russians have pointed out to me, you can stick a tire in this thing and it will grow something. It's just incredibly fertile. But unfortunately, the depth means that you have much more than a sea of mud. I would call it an ocean. And the ocean never froze. When it freezes, you can fight in the winter. If it doesn't freeze, which is what really happened to us this winter, there's not much you can do. Ukrainians, by the way, were also constrained in how much they could do. And that's why the Ukrainians began relying very, very heavily on masses of light infantry. And of course, that was the ideal outcome from the Russian standpoint. Please send us more living Ukrainians that we can slaughter. So this war of attrition has worn itself out. I think the bloodbath in Bakhmut has served its purpose. And the decision now is to await the end of the rains and then launch a serious Russian offensive. However, in the meantime, Mr. Zelensky has come under enormous pressure from Washington to build up a reserve of some size and hurl it against the Russian defenses. And I think he's been told, frankly, either you attack the Russians, or frankly, you might as well arrange surrender terms. In other words, if you want to stay in the game and stay alive, you've got to sacrifice more Ukrainian soldiers in a pointless counterattack. The other thing that's happened over the last several months is almost total annihilation of the air defense network. It was never an integrated air defense system on the scale of the Russians, but they've reached the point now where there's almost no air defense. That means that your ground forces are open to all sorts of attack. And the Russians have also perfected, as you were intimating earlier, the integration of the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms and complexes with the strike forces on the ground. So right now, there is nothing that can advance towards the Russians from the Ukrainian side without the Russians quickly identifying it, targeting it, and destroying it. And we've seen that in the most recent missile and air attacks over the last several days. But what's really important happened yesterday. And this is a point I want to make. All of your viewers will remember that the Russians have never destroyed the bridges over the Dnieper River. A lot of people have been asking, well, what's wrong with this? In fact, the Russian population said, why don't you destroy these bridges over the Dnieper and just trap all these Ukrainian forces on the east side and kill them? There was never any response from the Russian General Staff, and the Russian General Staff does not usually share its plans. But the bottom line is those bridges are intact. And most of those bridges, particularly when you get up to this place called Dnipro, which I think used to be Dnipropetrovsk, there is a very good bridge there that will support heavy armor, heavy equipment. But what the Russians did this weekend was very telling as to where we're headed. They attacked bridges on the border between Moldova and Ukraine and destroyed them with vast numbers of missiles. Now, why is this important? If you go to the Romanian border with Ukraine along the Black Sea, it's terrible. It's a terrible area to maneuver in, to move in. And the only good areas to move through, if you're going to move large numbers of troops, is to move up through southern Moldova and then over this very large bridge that was there for traffic. There's a rail bridge that was also destroyed, but it's primarily this very good bridge because that bridge is the link to Odessa. And what the Russians have just done is foreclose the NATO option of committing large ground forces through Romania and Moldova into southern Ukraine in the direction of Odessa. So Odessa is very definitely on the menu. Secondly, a buildup of Ukrainian forces down in Odessa has been detected, including 14 Leopard tanks. And these forces have now come under very determined attack by the Russians. So I think what we're witnessing now is the last stage before the Great Offensive, which is going to move north up to the Dnipro. And I think we'll see another massive movement across the Dnieper River and then south into Odessa. I think we'll see some movement through the center up through Bakhmut and that avenue of approach, and further north and east towards Kharkov. Remember, there are about 300,000 forces down in the south with 200,000 more Russian reserves behind them, either in Western Russia or behind those that are already in the south. And that doesn't include the 150,000 Russian troops sitting up in Belarusia. So the Russians have almost, I would say, an inexhaustible mountain of ammunition, missiles, rockets, aircraft, bombs, you name it. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, as has been pointed out, are running out of what they do have, which is not very much. And NATO and its allies, in other words, the Americans and the European allies, simply don't have additional equipment and weapons and munitions to send. And most of the equipment that we've been sending, for instance, additional tanks, some additional artillery ammunition, this is not going to make any difference when you are operating against an enemy that has perfected this ISR strike complex, which the Russians began talking about in the 1970s and has now become a reality. For the Russians, Ukraine is now something akin to a chessboard where everything is targeted. Nothing can be hidden. And if everything can be targeted, it can also be destroyed.
Interesting, fascinating in point of fact. Well, am I correct in thinking that Moldova's constitution prohibits any foreign troops on its soil? And so I'm not quite sure. I realize that if the Americans want to do something like that, they will go ahead and do it. But I'm not quite sure whether that, I don't think that would get much support from the Moldovan population, I don't think, would it?
Well, I'm shocked that you would suggest that the United States does not scrupulously obey international law. Obviously, if that's something we want to do, we would do it. And I know that we have sent lots of people over there to examine the roads. We have elements in the country. You're right. The Moldovan population does not want to be dragged into the Ukraine war by any means. And of course, you have this small group of Dniestrian Russians on the edge of Moldova, and a sort of autonomous, independent Dniestrian republic that also includes some Russian troops. I think the Ukrainians, who are hard pressed to do much of anything now in eastern Ukraine, have wisely stayed away from that. But now that we see that the bridge is out, the major bridge was so vital and essential over the river that borders Moldova and Ukraine. And remember, all of these rivers in Eastern Europe are enormous. They're very different from what people think of in Western Europe. These things are enormous. And you just can't get over them easily unless you have substantial bridging equipment and so forth. So the US forces that are down in Romania are now staring at a very difficult situation if somebody is prepping them to work their way into southern Ukraine. But again, you still have lots of NATO forces in Poland, particularly American forces, 40,000+, along with the Polish army, which has grown increasingly large. But we can come back to that, because as this Russian offensive takes off, once the Ukrainians have expended themselves, which I think is inevitable now, the Russians will then begin this deliberate move north. Kharkov will be taken. Odessa will come back under Russian control, because historically these are Russian cities. They were built by Russians and have been Russian since time immemorial. The rest of Ukraine, I suspect the Russians will wait to see if there is any interest in any kind of negotiation before they complete the conquest and march to the Polish border.
Have we got an historical, and I'm playing slightly devil's advocate on this, if I may, historical analogies at all? I mean, Bakhmut is telling me, is whispering in my ear, this is Verdun in 1916, with and the Germans bleeding the French army on the anvil of Verdun. This seems to me to be a strategic play by the Russians, bringing them in to destroy them. And actually, as you say, not cutting anything off, because Zelensky or the regime or Washington are actually playing the Russians' game at the moment, and their doctrine is to destroy the opposition army, not to hold ground, which is not of any particularly great tactical value. So I sort of see a little bit of Verdun, and if I may just add to that question before you pick up on it, because I know you're an expert in these historical things. Is there another analogy, perhaps, that we did see the Germans run out of puff in 1918 with the Kaiser's offensive, and the last 100 days came to open warfare, and it was wrapped up, of course, by November the 11th. We also saw, didn't we, the German attack when we thought they'd run out of puff, we thought they didn't have anything left in the bag, air cover in particular, and the Allies had total command of the air. But they still fought through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, and they still were continuing fighting when they retreated past the Rhine, notwithstanding the horrendous losses in the Falaise Gap. Is there any possibility of history repeating itself in any mutated form in this way?
Well, the problem with the Verdun analogy is that the Germans took, I would say, serious losses, inflicting heavy losses on the French. In fact, through most of the war, for every 2 British or French casualties, there was 1 German. That was pretty much the average. The Germans outfought the British and the French continuously. They outfought us. In fact, we never did very well against the Germans in Europe. We never improved the ratio of kills beyond 1 to 1, despite overwhelming firepower. I think a better analogy might be 1943. In the spring, you had a chief of the Russian General Staff who was the son of a Tsarist artillery officer, and whose grandfather was a Tsarist artillery officer, who miraculously had escaped annihilation during Stalin's purge. And he was the one who had the intestinal fortitude and guts to stand up to Stalin in the spring of 1943 and insist that the Germans, the Russians or the Soviets, not attack the Germans. Some of your viewers may understand that there were several offensives in 42 and 43 in Russia against the Germans. One near Moscow, which was just a terrible disaster for the Soviets, and then one that came later with Stalingrad. And even though Stalingrad turns into a German disaster. It was never what people in the West thought it was. And the losses the Soviets took, some estimates are 1 million during the entire Stalingrad campaign. And this chief of the general staff understood this, and Stalin, much like Hitler, was always demanding attack, 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 attack. And anybody who refused to attack was essentially on his way to the wall to be shot. And this chief of staff stood up to Stalin and said, we can't do that. So Stalin brought in Zhukov and several other Russian general officers and said, what do you think? And they were scared to death, but they finally had the strength to say, we agree with the chief of staff. This is not the time for us to attack. We should go to the strategic defense and let the Germans attack us. And Stalin said to the chief of the Russian general staff, what makes you think the Germans will attack? And of course, the answer was, because I know the Germans, and offensive warfare is their trump card. That's where they win. Only this time they won't, because will be unable to maneuver. We will present an impregnable defense. Well, the rest is history. He was right. You got the Battle of Kursk, and the Germans broke off the battle. Some would say prematurely because they were winning it. You know, that's one school of thought, but the fact is that they did break it off. And what followed Kursk was a major offensive. And that offensive broke the southern flank of the Germans in Russia. And I think what you're going to see is something similar with Kursk, where the Ukrainians have expended themselves. They pull back to whatever defensive line they think they can man, which is not going to be very good. They won't have much left, and the Russians will simply roll right over them in great numbers. But again, what we've seen with the Russians is a deliberate approach that ensures that Russian ground forces do not move beyond that ISR strike complex range. In other words, in Vietnam, we had infantry on the ground that was always told, you never move beyond the range of artillery. Well, today with the Russians, you have a similar phenomenon. Although this complex covers most of Ukraine, they're not going to move any faster than they have to and put at risk the connectivity that they have to this vast array of strike forces and their overhead surveillance. In other words, they're not going to walk into any traps. They're not going to march into anything where they could potentially lose soldiers unnecessarily. So while it will be a major offensive, it will be very deliberate. It will take weeks, but I predict that by the end of the summer, if not sooner, the war in Ukraine will be, for all intents and purposes, over. The Ukrainians will have been destroyed, crushed, and the only question is, what do we in the West do at that point?
Just popping back to March 1918, if you'll excuse me for so doing. Of course, the strategic position was that the Germans were holding French and Belgian ground. And so the onus was on the Allies to attack the Axis forces all the time to clear them out of that land. And of course, the attacking force, certainly by the order of those days, is always, I don't think that it's changed since my day many years ago, of needing a 3-to-1 superiority in order to carry out a successful attack. So the attacking forces historically have always suffered greater, have they not, than the defending forces, and particularly, of course, the Hindenburg Line, where they were dug in concrete bunkers. Okay, that might have produced a bunker mentality. Now, to get back to Bakhmut, it seems to me, yes, they've kept open to try and bleed the Ukrainians, which seems to me to be being very successful. That seems to me to be a successful situation. Perhaps you could just outline for a bit of, you have just touched on it there. You know, an oldie like me is always looking at air power, superiority of air power, which we had, of course, in France, so on and so forth. Am I right in thinking now, in the modern way, is that you really don't need chaps in aeroplanes flying all over the place, or is that slightly passé?
Well, I think you're half right. Manned aircraft are on the downswing, if you will, because of the precision paradigm and the multitude of guided missiles and rockets and other forms of strike that can be launched from the ground or launched from the sea. However, in most cases, the Russians have been using these bombers to launch strikes with Kinshal missiles, for instance, actually launching them from over Russian territory into Ukraine. Now, some of these are what they call glide bombs. These are simply precision guided bombs. They've got kits on them. We started this a long time ago that allow you to take a 500-pound or larger bomb, put some wings on it, give it a precision guiding packet, and these you launch with great devastating effect against your enemy. These things have been launched in the hundreds, if not thousands, over the last few weeks, decimating Ukrainian defenses and storage areas. They've blown up thousands of tons of ammunition. This continues. And I think, yes, the manned aircraft, the age of dominance by the manned aircraft is probably over until such point in time that you can destroy the air defenses. Now, once you destroy the air defenses, then manned aircraft are liberated to operate pretty much wherever they want to go. That's also happened now. We now see close air support strikes coming in from the Russians against Ukrainian troop concentrations in southern Ukraine. I think we'll see more of that. But as long as you have modern air defenses, it's very, very difficult to use air power as we did in the past. So what I would not say that there is no use for manned aircraft. What I would simply say is that we're going to shift in a balance of investment, if you will. We will invest far, far more heavily in all of these precision munitions and rockets and missiles that are launched from the ground, as well as in the overlapping integrated radar arrays and the overhead surveillance, because those things are much more difficult to defeat than simply shooting down an aircraft. But we will still have manned aircraft. There will still be manned air platforms. There's no question about it. But, if you wanted to point to an area where I think we're in real trouble, it's too much reliance on helicopters. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Today, if you're a helicopter, you fly forward anywhere in Ukraine, you're going to be shot out of the sky. So if you're going to use helicopters, it'll be behind your advancing forces where you're relatively secure within the framework of your own integrated air defense network. And this also raises serious questions about the utility of maintaining, as we do, large numbers of soldiers who, at least in theory, will fall out of airplanes, land someplace and do something. I think that age is over. Other than very small numbers and special operations forces, that just doesn't make any sense. You're going to get them killed.
For our viewers, there will be some confusion in people's minds about the Wagner situation, who are sort of, as I understand it, sort of mercenaries, but it's on a very big scale. Is there any analogy here between perhaps our use of Gurkha troops in a very smaller type of way that, one could argue as mercenary troops? And they're now saying there seems to be some sort of split, and is that disinformation that they feel they're not getting what they want, or the infighting going around, or is that part of the kind of disinformation that we had before D-Day? Where we were, we had imaginary armies and rubber tanks and General Patton being supposedly in Kent, so on and so forth. Do you think that's possible? I know disinformation works under these circumstances, and it doesn't strike me as wildly Russian, though. Anyway, perhaps I'm wrong. Well, what's your take on that?
Well, if you were looking for an analogy to the Wagner organization, I would go to the French Foreign Legion, because the Wagner organization is loyal to the Russian state and the Russian people. So they are not mercenaries. Mercenaries will fight for whomever pays them. The French Foreign Legion consists, I would say, in the enlisted level, obviously, perhaps 50+% of foreigners who have sworn to serve in the Legion, but in doing so, they also swear allegiance to France. So just as the French Foreign Legionnaires are soldiers of France, Wagner's soldiers are the soldiers of Russia, and we should not misunderstand that. Now, they do have some Serbs in their ranks. They have a number of foreigners in their ranks, but they are there to serve Russia. Now, they were recruiting heavily from people in prisons who had light sentences. In other words, these were not brutal murderers being released or rapists. And many of those people have now served their term and survived and are going to be released back into the population with a pardon. Prigozhin recently said he's not going to recruit as heavily from that sector of society as he has in the past. But he's turned out to be a very able soldier in his own right. He's produced a very effective fighting force, a fighting force with enormous esprit. Now, having said that, keep in mind that Prigozhin has a personal relationship with President Putin, that Prigozhin's organization has operated all over the world, much like the French Foreign Legion in parts of Africa and the Middle East. That's not the case with the Russian army. The Russian army is largely at home to defend Russia. And as a result, President Putin gives him a certain amount of leeway that perhaps would not be granted to others in a similar position, say Corps Command. There are other Russian forces that have fought extremely well. You don't hear about them because Russian general officers in the regular Russian army do not grandstand. They do not go public. They do not complain about what it is that they do or do not have. But Prigozhin's complaints have been answered, and right now, Prigozhin's force has come under the direct control, if you will, of General Surovikin, who is now ensuring that they're provisioned with the equipment they need. But we still think that Kadyrov and his Chechen forces will ultimately move in and replace Prigozhin's forces to give them a well-earned rest. And I think you're going to see that happen gradually over the next few weeks. Again, all of this is part of the prep for the coming offensive. And I think they'll want to use Prigozhin's forces in other areas once that offensive begins.
Well, thank you for that. That's cleared that up. That's very, very clear to me now. I understand it fully, and I don't think I did before. Very briefly, can I turn to the political situation, which I think is very similar. Dissent is verboten in this country on COVID, climate change. There are sort of 4 or 5 things where there is no dissent at all allowed in mainstream media. And obviously just sticking to the Ukraine situation at the moment, we have an interesting situation insofar as even the Daily Telegraph, which used to be regarded as a quality newspaper, and you spent enough time in Europe, I know, Colonel, to understand that, and their former defense correspondents included people like Claire Hollingworth and John Keegan. These people were giants in their field years ago, 40 years ago. We now have pygmies, and the platform, they're being given this platform, quite junior officers who have gone into politics. We have who found themselves on defense committees. So that these people have maybe short service commissions, very junior level. They haven't passed staff college. They haven't passed the Joint Service Staff College. They haven't passed Royal College of Defence Strategy College or anything like that. But they have a political platform now, and that people tend to look at them and say, oh, well, he was an ex-soldier, he must know what he's talking about. But what we're actually getting, and I've got this delight in this name, I've got his name, I thought you might enjoy this, Hamish de Breton Gordon. I thought you'd love that one, you all lot, really, Colonel. It sounds like it anyway, although no, you probably don't like the Gordons. And another guy called Tobias Elwood, who is actually on the British Defence Committee. These guys are being given senior platforms, and what they're actually saying now is the exact reversal of what you and I feel, that, oh, the war is virtually over now, Ukraine's won it. Honestly, I can't believe this, so I don't know where this is coming from. And of course, we have senior generals, and I know you have the same problem in America, and I'm sure we share this view. You cannot get above 1 star rank in either of our armies unless you are politically correct. It's a political appointment. You just can't get above 1 star unless you sing off the same hymn sheet. You've got to be anti-Russian. You've got to be in favor of diversity, whatever that actually means in the army, all these things. And our outgoing political general, Carter, chief of staff, we used to call him the chief of general staff, but Carter, and there's a new guy that's come in who's the same sort of mouthpiece, saying, this is Britain, right? This is Britain. We need to build up our army so that we can take on Russia. This is so ludicrous from a 4-star. I mean, it beggars belief. the standard at the Staff College in the late 1940s, as I think I mentioned when I interviewed you before, was General Montgomery. He gave them one tip. He said, "Let me give you one tip at Staff College: never march on Moscow."
Yeah.
And it seems we have learnt absolutely nothing. And it seems that we both have these political dynamics. We've got an ex-prime minister who actually wants to draw the Ukraine into NATO now. He wants to send the Royal Air Force there to give them air support. There's a sort of suicidal wish by some very senior politicians with no mainstream media dissent at all. And this is very worrying. And I don't understand how they can come to these conclusions. The Economist is the same. The editorial a couple of months ago, The Economist, that the war's over now, it's China we need to worry about. Where do these people come from? Have you got anything you could say to help us on this?
For your British audience, I would say a couple of things. First, that certainly during the reign of George III, there were numerous members of Parliament, outspoken critics, writers and so forth of the American Revolution. Many were openly sympathetic to General Washington and his cause of independence, and they said so. They were not jailed. They were not suppressed. They were not shut down. There was a greater degree of free speech then, I suspect, than what you have today under that monarchy. That's troubling to me. And I hope that there are other people in Britain that will find that troubling as well. The second thing I would point out is that Palmerston, who was the king's first minister several times, he came back in the 1860s. After having been out of office, he became the king's first minister again. And at the time, the British were watching the Danish-Prussian-Austrian War that had broken out in 1863. There were voices in Great Britain, for reasons that are not entirely clear to me today, but there were voices then, many in Parliament, who said that we should land a British army in Denmark and support the Danes against the Prussians and the Austrians. And Palmerston talked about it, and he said there is no doubt that if we landed 110 or 120,000 of our troops on the Danish peninsula, that they would turn in a great performance. And everybody, of course, said, "Hear, hear, hear, hear." But he said this would not make a great deal of common sense, given the fact that neither we nor the Danes nor both of us combined have the necessary capability on the ground to confront the millions and millions of German forces in Austria and Prussia. And everyone sort of said, well, you know, he's got a point. He understood that Britain's great trump card in strategic terms was the Royal Navy. But the Royal Navy wasn't going to make a damn bit of difference to the outcome of the war between Denmark, Prussia, and Austria. And ultimately, the British stayed out of that war, thankfully. That unfortunately, there was no one like Palmerston in 1914 to talk sense into the British people and the Parliament about why Britain should stay out of the First World War, and should have. And this tendency to overestimate yourself in the United States and Great Britain was both based on a serious problem. We both have got it, and that is fighting weak opponents repeatedly over many, many, many years. Opponents that in most cases don't even have armies, navies, air forces. And even in those cases where they did, those forces were weak. And so you end up with the British Expeditionary Force in 1914, a very fine force. I mean, man for man, one of the best that the British ever fielded. They turned in a good performance, and they had absolutely no chance whatsoever of surviving the encounter with the German army. They ultimately were very fortunate. And the French, as you know, took tremendous casualties. I mean, if you look at the opening battles in 1914, the numbers of dead piling up on the French side were horrendous. But by the time the Germans sort of screw themselves into the wall without much effort on the part of the British and the French, and this offensive grinds to a halt, the British can control 20 miles of front, and the other 400 plus miles of front are controlled by the French. The British have never maintained large standing armies. Neither have we. And we have always tended, at least until the First World War, to stay out of these encounters that would cause enormous casualties. And we prefer maritime power and increasingly in the 20th century, aerospace power. So I think you're listening to people who are speaking with no knowledge of real warfare. Now, you mentioned World War I earlier. This is something very few people in Britain understand. When the American forces, and there were 2 million of us that landed in France, when we finally fought, we only fought for 110 days. That's it. And in 110 days, we took 318,000 casualties. And in 110 days, we had 110,000 dead. Now that's war. And that's war between Europeans. And that kind of war could occur if you fought the Chinese or the Japanese or the Koreans. The rest of the world is not terribly martial in its orientation, its culture, its activity. But when you fight weak opponents, as we both have, you end up with lots of people that say, oh yeah, we can do this and this. And they'll say, oh, by the way, I did this. And I've talked to people and they've asked me about the actions in which I was involved. And I said, today, given the overhead surveillance and the array of strike forces, probably a third of the force I led into action, 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns, perhaps a third would have been injured or destroyed. Long before I made contact with the enemy, because we had no air defense. We had no air and missile defense. And that sort of thing is grossly underestimated. But that kind of thing is what the Russians understand very well. If you go and look at Gareev, who was a brilliant man, a colonel general who was originally under Ogarkov in the 70s, he still writes prolifically. Go to his writings, a great book called If War Comes Tomorrow. And Gerasimov knows him, everyone knows him. All of these people are students of their profession. And that's the other point. We've never taken our professions very seriously. I mean, if you look at the promotion systems in the US Army and the British Army, maybe you're better off than we are now, but it's an awful lot of cronyism that drives who is promoted and not demonstrated character, competence, or intelligence. And of course, the British always suffered from that to some degree. John Ericsson, a brilliant Sovietologist who taught at the University of Edinburgh. He was from Northern England. I visited with him in 1992, and he said, Douglas, you have to keep in mind that until the late 60s, early 70s, in order to make brigadier in the British Army, you had to demonstrate conclusively that you were stupid. Now, I mean, you know, that's a sad comment, but it's not far off. And all you have to do is pick up JFC Fuller and read his works. And he makes it very clear what the problem was. We have a similar problem today because everything that doesn't count matters. And the things that